तत्त्वविधिर्मतम्
अमृतत्वं हि विन्द्यते
अमृतं हि विन्द्यते
आत्मना विन्दते वीर्यम्
आत्मना विन्दते वीर्यम्
विद्यया विन्दते मृतम्
विद्यया विन्दते मृतम्.
So I'll just mute you all. So we saw in the last class, of course, we saw the explanation of this particular mantra, and we took up the discussion on a particular darshana, the author of which is Bharata Prapancha, and it is called Jnana Karma Samuchchaya. So to briefly recall what we said, Bharata Prapancha says that the word janati, knowing, is a verb, and any verb normally indicates an action, and any action normally indicates the presence of a sentient being, and the mind is insentient, and therefore action cannot belong to the mind. It has to belong to Atma. Therefore, knowing cannot belong to the mind. It has to belong to Atma. That was one of the tenets of the Matam. Then he said that Atma is Indriya Agocharam. It is therefore not knowable through perception. It has to be knowable only through Anumana Pramanam. That was one more of the tenets. And the third one was that Atma is inert, but it has the property of knowing. And when Atma is in the act of knowing something, then at that point of time, Atma is conscious, Atma is sentient. And when it is not knowing, then Atma is inert, it is insentient. Therefore, knowledge comes and goes. Therefore, knowledge is a product of karma. And we saw the khandanam, the rejection also. Shankara says that if all these conditions are fulfilled, then knowledge will come and go in the Atma, and the Atma will be doing the action of knowing and not knowing. Therefore, Atma becomes subject to change. It becomes subject to Shadvikara. And anything which is subject to Shadvikara is Anityam, and that has to be rejected because Shastra says that Atma is Nityam. So in brief, that was what we saw. Now we take up the Nyaya Vaisheshika Matam. So these are two or three important parts of the Bhashyam where Shankara is talking about the different darshanas, what is their view, and then he does a khandanam, he does the refutation. So this is what we are talking about right now. So Jnana Karma Samuchchaya khandanam has been done, and we are looking at the discussion on the Nyaya Vaisheshikas. So Nyaya Vaisheshika is who is the main guru or the author?
Kannada.
It's not just Kannada, okay? Don't look at the English name and say Kannada. It is not Kannada, it is Kannada.
Kannada Rishi.
Kannada Rishi. And therefore it is called Kannada Matam. Kannada Rishi, Kannada Matam. In Malayalam, actually, Kannada means that which is not seen, but that is by the way only. Okay. So Shankara says that the following is the interpretation of Kannada. What is that? Consciousness is a property of Atma. Like we say, Devadatta is fat. Therefore, we are saying Atma is conscious. So Devadatta is the noun. Fatness is the adjective, the property. And when you say that Atma is the noun, and you say Atma is conscious, then consciousness is the property. What did Bharata Prapancha say? It's a product, right? It's a product arising out of the action of knowing. That consciousness comes because of the action of knowing. Therefore, it is a product of the Atma. Here, Kannada says it's not a product of the Atma. It is a property of the Atma. And he says this is a property which is generated. It's a generated property. Like for example, when you light the candle, if a flame comes out, right? You burn the wick and the light comes. So it's a generated property. And therefore, he has to explain what he means by generated property, because generated property is different from a property which is always present. So are you getting the, the sort of, what do you call, brainstorming which is going on? These are all academic brainstorming, but all meant to give you some insight into how debates take place, and it keeps our mind strong. So Canada says that it is a property, but it is not an intrinsic property like heat. Heat is a property of fire, and heat is an intrinsic property. It is always present. Canada says this consciousness is a generated property. It is not an intrinsic property. So it comes at specific times under specific conditions. Like as I said, the light that comes out of the candle when you burn the candle. What is the specific condition? The candle wick has to be burnt, then the light is seen. And so here Canada says, yes, the same argument is here. It is generated. This consciousness is generated in Atma when two inert materials combine together. Okay, now that requires some explanation, because we have not studied Vaisheshika Matam. So very briefly, I'll tell you that the Vaisheshika Matam, or the Kannada, has enumerated 9 materials, 9 inert materials. So inert materials are known as dravyams. Okay, so 9 inert materials are there, out of which 5 you already know. What are they? 5 inert materials, you know what are they?
Akash, Vayu, Agni.
5 Panchabhutas. Okay, the 5 Panchabhutas are Jada. We also studied in Tattva Bodha. So they are there. And then Kannada says there are 4 more. There is Kala, which is time. There is Dik, which is direction. There is Atma. So remember, Kannada is saying Atma is inert. So 5 Panchabhutas, Kala, time, Dik, direction, Atma, which is inert Atma, and mind, Manaha, which is inert Manaha. So 5 Panchabhutas plus Kala plus Dik plus Atma plus Manaha, the mind. Altogether 9 of them are there. The Vaisheshika Matam talks about 9 different inert materials, dravyams they're called. And then he says very specifically that, however, you cannot expect the consciousness to arise on the random combination of any of these dravyams. There has to be only 2 specific dravyams which combine. What is that? The inert Atma and the inert mind. When they combine, consciousness is generated. So please follow the arguments very, very carefully. And if at all you have a doubt, ask straight away, right? So he is saying that when 2 specific inert materials, so dravyams in the technical term is dravyams, which means inert materials. When there are 2 specific inert materials, dravya dvayam. What is that? Inert Atma and inert mind. When they combine, then that combination generates consciousness. And therefore, this is called Atma Mana Sanyogaha Bodhaha. The consciousness generated Bodhaha, generated by the Atma Mana Sanyogaha, by the combination of Atma and Mana. None of the other 7 inert materials can combine and give the consciousness. Only these 2, the inert mind and the inert Atma. So whenever we talk about inert mind and inert Atma, please remember this is the view of the Purvapakshi, of the Vaisheshika Matam. So don't get confused. As far as we are concerned, Atma is consciousness principle itself. Okay, so we are saying from the Purvapakshi's point of view, Atma is inert, mind is inert, and they combine together. And lo and behold, two inert materials, they give rise to something new, which is consciousness. Okay. Now, there is a further argument. This consciousness is therefore a property. Correct? Because it is giving rise to consciousness. And any property cannot exist by itself. Last statement is understood? Any property cannot exist by itself. So if somebody is a good dancer, that dancing property has its locus in the person who is the dancer. If somebody is fat, the fatness has the locus in the person. If somebody is intelligent, the intelligence has its locus in the person. So using that same argument, when these Atma and Manaha, both of which are inert, they combine and consciousness is generated, then there are only two materials involved. And therefore, consciousness has to have been the property of one of these materials, either Atma or the mind. Okay. So, Vaisheshika says, the Atma is all-pervading, Vibhuhu, infinite, while the mind is Anuhu. Anuhu means atomic in size, very minute in size. So that is another definition, that Atma is infinite and the mind is very, very minute. And therefore the Vaisheshika says that the property of Atma, the consciousness property, it is the property of Atma and not of the mind. Mind is involved in the production of this consciousness. How? By joining with the Atma. But in the production of the consciousness, the mind will continue to be inert. It will continue to be insentient. It is only the Atma which becomes sentient. And therefore, Atma will know the world and it's not the mind which knows the world. So, Atma, Mana, Samyogaha, that is the combination between, the union between the Atma and the Manaha will take place in Jagrata Avastha and in Swapna Avastha, and therefore Atma will have consciousness during these two avasthas. I'm going slow enough, hopefully. I'm trying to condense, Kannada into about 3 paragraphs. So if you don't understand, you have to get up and ask. Okay. So he's saying that when Atma combines with the mind, it is Atma which becomes conscious, and therefore Atma will be combining with the mind in Jagrata Avastha and in Swapna Avastha. So Atma Mana Sanyoga will take place in Jagrata Avastha and Swapna Avastha, which means Atma has consciousness during these two avasthas. Why does he have to say this? Because this is available to us by way of common experience, that we are conscious during Jagrata and Swapna avasthas. And then he says, Sushupti Avastha, Atma Mana Sanyoga is not there, Viyogam is there, separation. So Atma, Mana, Manaha do not combine during Sushupti Avastha, and therefore in Sushupti Avastha, Atma is not conscious, Atma is inert, it is Jadam. And that is why he says the Vaisheshika, in Sushupti Avastha, you do not know anything, because the Atma is Jadam. You are Jadam, how can you know anything? Atma, remember, means, another thing we have to remember now is that whenever I say Atma, don't think of Atma as some third party. Okay? Atma, the word, means I. So wherever the word Atma is used, replace it with I. So this is what he is saying, that you combine with the mind in Jagrata and Swapna avasthas, and therefore you are conscious, and therefore you are aware of what is happening in the Jagrata avastha and the Swapna avastha. However, in Sushupti avastha, you do not combine with the mind, and therefore you are inert, and that is why when you get up, you say, I don't know anything. And therefore, because of this connection, the Atma Mana Sanyogaha, because of this connection alone, the Atma becomes a knower. The notion, and therefore he says, why am I proposing this complicated theory? Because in the earlier you refuted the Jnana Karma Samuchaya, you refuted by saying that Atma undergoes changes, Shadvikara. And therefore, in this theory of mine, Atma is not undergoing any change at all. It is free from action. Because knowing is not an action in my theory, in my Vaisheshika theory, knowing is not an action, it is an attribute only. And therefore, Atma does not undergo any change. So the defect which you pointed out in the Jnana Karma Samuchaya, saying that Atma is Shadvikara, that is avoided. And he gives an example. He says, like the pot getting painted, the pot getting associated with red paint. If you paint the pot has a coating of paint, but the pot does not change. So this is the view of the Vaisheshika Mata. So before starting to the refutation of Shankara, any questions? Do you understand what is the view of Vaisheshikas and how it is different from the Jnana Karma Samachayas? So in legal language, silence is taken as consent, okay? So I am taking as all of you agree that you understood. Okay. What is the refutation? Shankara says in this matam, in this darshana also, what will happen? Atma will become an insentient principle. How? How does Atma become insentient?
When there is Viyoga with the mind.
When there is Viyoga, Atma becomes insentient. And therefore he says this is Shruti Virodaha, contradicting the Shruti. And Nyaya Vaisheshika are Astika or Nastika?
Astika.
Astika, which means they believe in the Shruti and they should not be saying anything which contradicts the Shruti. And Shruti says that Atma is conscious. And therefore it says your theory that consciousness comes and goes, basically it is, it is saying that during Jagrata Avastha and Swapna Avastha you are conscious and during Sushupti you are not conscious. And therefore you are you are contradicting the Shruti which says that Atma is conscious all the time. And therefore it is a major dosha. And he quotes, Shankara quotes one or two Shruti Vakyams. We have not done these, but I'll just quote for your information. One is from Brihadaranyaka. He says, Vijnanam Anandam Brahma. Brahma is consciousness and Ananda. Vijnanam, consciousness. Ananda is Ananda, bliss. So, Vijnanam Anandam Brahma is a Shruti Vakyam from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It says Brahman is conscious and has the nature of Ananda. And then there's the Aitareya Upanishad, which has one of the Mahavakyas, Prajnanam Brahma, also says that Atma is conscious. And therefore, Shankara says that you being an Astika, you cannot take a stand that Atma is not conscious, it's not sentient, because it is Shruti Virodha. That is as far as Shruti is concerned. And Shankara wants to say, I am not just relying upon Shruti, I am relying upon logic also. So he says it is Yukti Virodha also. Yukti means logic. What is the logic? He says two materials can combine only if they have parts. Right? What is the combination process? One part contacts another part. Does it make sense? One part contacts another part. So take a very simple example. When you have put on your clothes, one part of the cloth is contacting or touching one part of your body, right? And such a connection is possible when both the materials have got parts. Your body has parts and the cloth also has parts. And that is why you cannot ever say that my body is in contact with space. Why? Because your body has parts, but space has no parts. Therefore, the statement that my body is in contact with space is incorrect. What is the correct statement?
My body is in space.
My body is in the space. Okay. What is the difference? When you move out, the space still remains. And that's why there is no contact. Now, Shankara says, you yourself say, hey Vaisheshika, that Atma is infinite. And an infinite entity, does it have parts or no parts?
No parts.
There are no parts. And then you say the mind is anuhu, atomic. Again has no parts. It's so small that it has no parts. How can one partless entity contact another partless entity? One because it is too small, and the other because it has no locational locus. It is all over the place. How can one partless entity contact another partless entity, and therefore there can be no Atma Mana Sanyoga? Okay. Now, you may object to this, and you might say that, let us assume that your argument is not correct, hey Shankara, that a partless entity can come into contact with another partless entity. Then there is a stronger argument. Okay, this is one argument which says that one partless entity cannot contact another partless entity. Of course, it refutes the Vaisheshika views, but Shankara says there is a stronger argument. Supposing you say, I don't agree with you, one partless entity can contact another partless entity. So now it's a hypothetical argument. It's called Abhyupeta Vadaha, an argument for the sake of the argument, not conceding that it contacts. So Abhyupeta Vadaha, Shankara says, let us have a hypothetical agreement. Assume that the partless mind can come in contact with the partless Atma. When are they in contact? There are only two possibilities. Either they are in contact or they are never in contact. And if they are in contact, they are never in contact, we are dismissing because we are saying that let us assume that they're in contact. So when are they in contact? Are they always in contact, or are they in contact off and on?
Always.
Why so? Why do we say that in such a circumstance, the mind will always be in contact with Atma? You have to go by the views of Vaisheshika only, which I have outlined.
Because where is there to escape from the contact?
Exactly. But Atma is all pervading. How can you not be in contact? And therefore, if Atma is always in contact, Atma will always be the knower. But your matam says that during Sushupti Avastha, Atma is not the knower. Do you mean to say that during Sushupti Avastha, Atma has gone away? No. And therefore, according to this matam, if you have to agree to that matam, then Sushupti is a state which is an impossibility. There are only two arguments. Either the matam is wrong when it says that they are not always in contact, or Sushupti is a state which is not possible, which is against perception, right? And therefore, not only that, one more argument is there. When Atma joins the mind, Atma will become the knower, right? Why? Because through the mind. Because the mind is connected to the Indriyas, and the Indriyas are connected to the sense objects of the world, and that is how Pratyaksha Jnanam takes place, which is a theory which we also accept, right? That the Indriyas contact the world or the objects, and the mind contacts the Indriyas. Mind gives RC to the Indriyas, and the mind is given RC by the Atma. And therefore, ultimately, of course, we say RC is a knower, but here he is saying Atma is a knower, so that you have to concede that when Atma joins the mind, Atma will become the knower of everything that the mind is connected to through the sense organs. And this is how Pratyaksha Jnanam takes place. This is the Vaisheshika theory of knowledge. Okay, this is as far as the knowledge of sensory objects are being concerned. Then Shankara says, okay, how is memory generated? The Pratyaksha Jnanam of yours has created a vasana in the mind. Okay, supposing yesterday you have seen a tiger. So yesterday it was pratyaksha jnanam for you, but today you can recall the memory of the tiger. How is that memory generated? That pratyaksha experience of yesterday has created a vasana in your mind. And going by this theory of the Vaisheshikas, when Atma comes in contact with the mind which has the vasana of the tiger, then the tiger memory is generated. Okay, this is the theory. But here, Vaisheshika says that pratyaksha jnanam and memory jnanam, smriti jnanam, they are always kramena. They are always sequential. They are never simultaneous. This is the Vaisheshika theory of knowledge. That pratyaksha jnanam takes place in a normal way, but his addition is that the memory jnanam is always sequential. It is never at the same time as pratyaksha jnanam. And Shankara says that this part of your theory, that memory jnanam is sequential after perception, even you cannot explain. Okay, Shankara doesn't explain this very cryptic theory of his. He says that, hey Vaisheshika, even you cannot explain your theory, that memory comes after, in sequence. And Shankara leaves it at that. He thinks we are all smart enough to understand. But we all know we are not smart, okay? But luckily, there are sub-commentators called Tikakaras. Right? They explain. Pratyaksha happens when Atma, mind, Indriya, and object, when these are all connected. So, Atma, Mana, Indriya, Vishaya, Sanyoga. This has to be there. And Smriti comes when Atma, Mana of course is Vasana Sahita Mana which has got Vasanas. So, the first Pratyaksha happens in the connection of four things: Atma, mind, Indriyas, and objects. And memory, Smriti, happens when Atma is connected to the mind which has got the Vasana already stored in it. So, mind is always associated with Vasana, and mind is also associated with Indriyas and Vishayas. Therefore, how can you say there is a sequence? The Pratyaksha is there and Smriti is there. They're always there. Because it is the mind which associates with the objects through the Indriyas. It is the same mind which has got the Smriti also, memory also. And therefore, going by the Vaisheshika theory itself, both Pratyaksha and memory have to happen sequentially. How can you have to happen simultaneously, not sequentially? So Shankara says, how can you say there is a sequence? And that this is the explanation given by the Tikakara, that this is the flaw which cannot be explained by Vaisheshika Mata. Are you following? All very technical arguments, but useful for us to, what do you call, give a nice shake to our understanding. Anybody has not understood? If you're not understood, you can say. Nobody will think the worst of you. Okay, we are all beginners here.
Om Raviji,
Yes,
isn't
Maitri.
there one more kind of flaw in the matam, that how can two jada vastu produce chaitanyam?
That is from the point of our view. That is why he says that that particular consciousness has to belong to one of these two dravyams, and it's a property, but it's a generated property. It is not a natural property visible all the time. It comes into being only when these two mix. For a Vedantic, it is not acceptable at all.
No, in any case, something that is a karyam has to be produced, has to be already there in the karanam, in some, at least in some
Some
unmanifest form. Yeah.
That is what he's saying, that it is an unmanifest thing, but it's produced when it becomes manifest, when the two things combine.
Om Acharya ji. Sorry, I'm interrupting, but
Just
this is
let
a
Meda
direct.
finish. Just let Meda finish.
Yeah, so that was one thing, that why, how can this Chaitanya be produced, or if it is already there in some unmanifest form, then in which one and in what way is it there? That was one part of the flaw. And another, even an attribute that comes and goes, isn't that also considered a change?
It is a change. But that he is not saying. He is saying, I am not going by the Jnana Krama Samuchaya, because there it is produced by the action. Here it is already there. And that is the difference he is saying. There is a product, and here it's a property. The property is manifested, that is all. There it is actually produced by the karma in the other matam. That is the difference.
But it's still a change.
It is still a change. But that is what ultimately, that is why we dismiss all these. Shankara's dismissals are quite logical. He dismisses all these and says that is why he said very simply that you can't even explain what you are saying, and went off. While this guy says, no, it's not like that. Okay, Rinku.
Yeah, Acharya ji, with regards to this, how do we explain the generation of fire when the stick and the urni, they come together? So that is what I just wanted to understand. Where is the flaw in that? Because a fire is produced when two separate things are being brought together. So
Yeah.
what is the fire, the intrinsic property of?
Is there no other
So I
action
just
there?
wanted to
Are you just bringing the stick
the
and the
action.
fire and the
No,
sword?
the
Yes.
action is being done
There
by
is
somebody
friction.
who's bringing. Yes.
There is friction.
So
That's the friction causes the heat, and that causes the fire.
okay.
Okay, so far these are the two defects, and then there is one more Shruti defect, okay, which Shankara doesn't say, but which we can think about. What is that? You say Atma gets consciousness because of Manasambandha. Can anybody tell me what is wrong with that statement? Which is what Meda actually meant, but I'm not sure whether she's got the implication of how deep her statement was. Meda?
My first statement about the Chaitanya being produced from two Jada Vastus, that one? Or the second?
A slight,
flaw?
he's saying that when the Atma connects to Anatma, that is mind, then consciousness is generated. Is there a flaw in that statement? Shruti flaw, okay? Shruti Virodha flaw.
Because it's Anadi Atma. It can't be produced.
No, that's the view of the Vedantic, the Atma Anadi.
Acharya,
Yeah.
Shruti statements also say that Atma is self-illumining.
Okay, but that is not what we're talking about. See, remember that another name for Sambandha is what? Sangha. Now does it make sense?
Yeah, Atma is Asanga.
Atma is Asanga. Shruti says that Atma is Asanga. It cannot have a connection with anything at all. In that being so, how can Atma have a Sambandha with mind? So that itself is a Shruti statement, a Shruti Virodha statement. So therefore, it contradicts these things. It contradicts logic and it contradicts Shruti also. And therefore, remember, an object which is Saguna with form, with parts, will have a connection only to another object with parts. And therefore, Shankara says it cannot have a connection with something belonging to a different species. What does he mean here? He says all Anatma is Saguna. So, Saguna is one species, Atma is Nirguna, it is another species altogether. How can two different species connect together? Because such a combination is against the theory of your own theory, Nyaya Vaisheshika. It is against all logic. Do you see from this argument, what is the definition which we have been using since Bhagavad Gita days? What is that definition coming from this particular discussion? About consciousness, the 5 parts of consciousness. We have this 5-pointed discussion, right? The definition which we give, not a part, not a property, not a product, that comes from this discussion. If you have not asked so far, you should have asked, where does it come from? It comes from this discussion. And therefore he says, your matam is not logical. What is Atma really? It is that consciousness which is eternal, unbroken, and that alone is called Brahman. And he adds over here, when Atma is understood as the permanent Sakshi, which means when Atma is understood as that entity because of which the arrival and departure of the thoughts in the mind are illumined, then only is Atma understood. Otherwise, Atma has not been understood. So he says, a very nice little word, Atmanaha sarva bodha bodhatrave. When Atma is understood as the sarva bodha bodhatre, the illuminator of bodhritva, illuminator of sarva bodha, all thoughts, then alone Atmanaha siddhyati. Then alone it is really understood. Na anyatha. It is not understood at all. So with this, two Astika matams have been dismissed by Shankaracharya. Okay. The question might arise, what about Nastika matams? Nastika matams also have their own, theories. Why not take up one of those? So Shankara says, fine, we will deal with the most popular one, which is what? The most popular Nastika matam is what?
Buddhism.
Buddhism, right? So Shankara takes up Buddhism. Now again, we have not done Buddhism in great detail, but by the time we reach Taittiriya and all that, we'll have a little more discussions. But here I'll very briefly summarize. Buddhism we often think is one, right? But there are 4 subdivisions of Buddhism. And one is called Vaibhashika Buddhism, one is called Sautrantika Buddhism, one is called Yogachara Buddhism, and one is called Madhyamika Buddhism. So here we are dealing with the third variety called Yogachara Buddhism. And Yogachara Buddhism is very, very close to Vedanta. Because here also they say Jagat is Mithya and the observer consciousness is Satyam, which is what we say, right? Jagat Mithya, Brahma Satyam. So here also the Buddhist says that the observer consciousness is, he doesn't use the word Brahman, but he says the observer consciousness is Satyam and Jagat is Mithya. So far so good. But then he starts with, more complications. He says this consciousness can be proved only by the consciousness knowing itself. Okay, if you take the temperature of your forehead, it will be slightly above normal right now, but that's quite normal. Okay, so he says consciousness is both subject and object, and therefore this theory has another name, Swasamvedyata Vadaha, that theory by which one knows oneself. So what is the problem here? Buddhism accepts that consciousness is the observer, and then they put in one very ingenious, tenet over here. They say any observation is only momentary. Okay, that we also don't dispute. Any observation is only momentary, and therefore Buddhism now says that since any observation is only momentary, and the observation cannot take place in the absence of an observer, the observer is also momentary. And that is, he uses the term Shanikam. The observer is also Shanikam, momentary. And that is why this theory is also called Shanika Vada. That name you have heard of, which is Yogachara Buddhism. Another name is Shanika Vada. Here they say that consciousness is only momentary. What is the problem with consciousness being momentary? First they said consciousness can be proved only by consciousness. And now they are saying consciousness is only momentary. So the consciousness of the first moment, it is Shanikam. It comes and goes. And therefore, when the consciousness of the second moment arises, the consciousness of the first moment has come and gone. How will the consciousness of the second moment be a proof that there was a consciousness in the first moment?
Otherwise, there will have to be two consciousnesses in the same moment.
Which is not possible. And
Yeah.
that's one of the defects. Remember that pratyaksha pramanam, which is what we are saying, consciousness. Your pratyaksha pramanam, actually seeing, that pratyaksha pramanam is functional when? Only in the present. Pratyaksha pramanam is not functional in the past, nor can it be functional in the future. The future and past have to be anumanam only. And therefore, the consciousness of any movement can observe the consciousness of only that moment. So in the second moment, the consciousness of the first moment is no longer present, because in the second moment, a new consciousness is existing. And therefore, there is no continuity. Hence, consciousness has only momentary existence, kshanikam existence. Therefore, perception can prove only that present momentary consciousness. And that is why this darshanam is called kshanika darshanam, kshanika vijnana darshanam. And they give the example. They say it's like taking a bath in the Ganga. Okay. You think that you are taking bath in the Ganga river. But really what is happening, the water which flows over you at 8 o'clock is not the water which flows over you at 8:01. Completely different waters are there because of the constant flow of the water. That is one example. And he gives another example also. He says it is like a flame. The first drop of oil on the wick of the flame nourishes the flame. But the second drop of oil, does it nourish the same flame? No, it nourishes the second flame. Therefore, this flame is constantly dying and constantly being born again. Just like the river is constantly being born again every moment of your having a bath. And therefore, if in this matam, you are not a continuous jiva, if you go by this matam, you are a series of momentary jivas. You are not a continuous jiva at all, because there is no such thing as a continuous jiva in their theory. It is a series of momentary consciousness, momentary jivas. And therefore, because of this idea that consciousness is momentary, this pratibodhitam viditam, which is the discussion, the whole discussion is because of that particular statement. Pratibodhitam viditam matam, that particular statement, what does it talk about? Buddhism says that talks about consciousness revealing itself through a series of observations. And when understanding this, we have to remember the fundamental law in Vedanta. The subject and the object can never be the same. And the example we use is, we say eyes can never observe the eyes. The camera can never capture itself in the photograph. And the violation of this rule has a technical name. It is called kartru karma virodha doshaha. The subject object contradiction is there. The defect of subject object contradiction. And therefore, this particular theory of theirs is tainted by this particular dosha, karta karma virodha. And of course, this law has a very, very rare exception, which we talked about earlier. If something has several parts, then one part can become the subject and the other part can become the object. What is an example? Like our own bodies. When your hand is touching your face, both are you, both are the body, but one part of your hand is touching one part of your face. So you say, I am touching myself. And there the I is the subject and the object. It is possible. Why? Because the body has several parts. But in the case of Atma, this is not possible, because Atma has no parts at all. And therefore, Shankara says that Bauddha Matam really cannot be validated, because it goes against the Shruti, which says Atma has no parts. Now, what is wrong with that statement? Shankara has made that statement. Well, why should he have not made the statement?
Because they don't accept Shruti anyway.
Sorry?
They don't accept Shruti anyway. They're
Because the
Nastika.
Buddhist doesn't accept Shruti. He's a Nastika. So there's no point making that comment too. So this particular part of the argument is for our consumption. Okay, he'll come up with logic later. But right now he says that, remember that Shastra talks about Atma having no parts. But the Buddhist is one better. Buddhist says, okay, you are quoting Shruti, I will also quote Shruti. I don't believe in Shruti, but I will quote Shruti. So he says, Atmanyev Atmanam Pashyati. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The Atma sees the Atma. That is in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. And very famous one which you should know from the 10th chapter. What is that? Swayamev Atmanam Manatmanam Vethatvam Purushottama. Right? Swayam eva Atmanam Vethi Tvam He Purushottama. Shankara says, fine. It is good that you have read the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads. I'm very grateful that you have read. But he says there is a problem in the interpretation. What is that? Whenever Shruti talks about Atma, you have to look at the context. Sometimes Atma means pure Atma, which we say Nirupadhika Atma, Atma without an Upadhi. But whenever we are in Vyavaharika discussions, Atma is always associated with what? With Panchakosha and Shariratrayam. And therefore, because of the close intimacy of the Atma with the Shariratrayam or the Panchakosha, that is also looked upon as the Atma. And therefore, there are two Atmas which are referred to in Shruti. One is pure consciousness without Upadhi, Nirupadhika Atma, and one is consciousness mixed up with the Upadhi, Sopadhika Atma. And if you are looking at Sopadhika Atma, Atma with Upadhis, then that Atma definitely has parts. It has got consciousness part and inert part also, Chetana Amsha and Jada Amsha also. And in such a Sopadhika Atma, definitely one part can be the knower of the other part. However, when it is Chaitanyam which illuminates the mind, what happens? The OC knows the mind. And when I say that I am Sakshi Chaitanyam, the OC, what is happening? The Brahma Asmi Vritti is actually in the RC. It is using the RC that I am recognizing the OC. And therefore, if you look at the statements in its context, it is not tainted by Kartra Karma Virodha Doshaha. Because Sopadhika Atma is being considered. And what is the Karta and what is the Karma? What is the subject? What is the object? They are two different parts associated with the Atma. Like when I say, I see my hand. My mind associated with the Atma is saying my hand also associated with Atma. So there is no defect in that. What about Nirupadhika Atma? In the case of pure consciousness not having any Upadhis, the Atma knowing itself is not possible. And he adds, so in the case of Sopadhika Atma, Atma associated with Upadhis, it is possible to say that I know myself, or it is possible to say that Atma knows itself. And in the case of pure consciousness, it is not possible to say that Atma knows itself, because Atma cannot act as subject and object without a Upadhi. And thirdly, he says, it is also not possible to say that something other than Atma can know consciousness, because anything other than Atma is only Anatma. And Anatma cannot know consciousness. Therefore, what are you to say? Atma does not need another consciousness to know itself. In the same way, as you say that this light does not need another light to illuminate it, in the same way, Atma does not need any other knowledge to know itself. But in the Bauddha philosophy, The Atma consciousness is only momentary. And because of that, there is an absence of the permanent Atma. And so these arguments are not valid. And therefore he says consciousness is all pervading. When you quote from the Upanishad, Nityam Vibhum Sarvagatam, Mundaka Upanishad, the Nityam contradicts the Shanikam. Right? And in Brihadaranyaka it says Atma, Ajara, Amaraha, Amrataha, Abhayaha. So Amaraha and Amrataha, which means what? Not subject to death and eternal, that also contradicts Shanikam. And therefore Shruti Vakyam will be contradicted. This argument is for our conception, okay, not for the Buddhist. But we can, why? Because Buddhist does not accept Shruti as Pramana. And you can give arguments based on logic also, one of which is what? If you are the Atma, one of the most powerful arguments which Shankara gives, he gives it not here, but he gives it in, I think it's in Bhagavad Gita Bhashyam. So he says that if you are Atma living momentarily, why should you do various sadhanas for moksha? Do you see why he's saying that? If you are a Shanika Jiva, why should you do any sadhana for moksha at all? What is the argument? Nobody?
Why do any sadhana for any impermanent thing?
No. That is not the argument here. The argument is that I am a Shanika Jiva. And if I am doing any sadhana, in the next Shanikam, am I there? I am not there.
No.
So what am I doing it for? It's a very powerful argument. Unless you are a continuous Jiva, moksha has no meaning for you. Because unless there is instantaneous moksha, which is not there, you have to do sadhana, you have to do karma yoga, you have to do upasana yoga, you have to do jnana yoga, you have to do nididhyasanam. By the time all that finish, a series of jivas would have come and gone. You are not there anymore. So why should you do any sadhana at all? And therefore Shankara says Buddhism is also not a valid interpretation of all this. So he dismisses that. And before we close, we'll look at two interpretations of the word pratibodham. So pratibodham has got, unfortunately, though Shankara talks about this in his Bhashyam, he doesn't name it. Which are the matams, which are the philosophies. So we don't know the names. Okay. So one is, pratibodha is given the meaning of intuitive cognition. What is intuitive cognition? He says, nirnimittam bodhaha. Nimittam is the cause, the hetu, the reason. So knowledge which arises in the mind without any pramanam. No pratyaksha, no anumana, no arthapatti. It just comes in the mind. And that is what we call intuition. And some people say that this is the meaning of pratibodha. So Brahman is known through this intuition only. Right? A lot of today's Gurujis, they talk about this intuitive knowledge of Brahman. Because if you don't know what Veda is, it is best to say that you will know intuitively. So nobody can ever challenge that statement. Okay? If they challenge you, you can say you have not developed the intuition. What can I do? You stay with me for another 100 years and give me dakshina, and then I will teach you how to develop intuition. Right? So this is one type of people. They say Brahman is known through nirnimitta bodham, intuition only. And they give an example. They say that in Sushupti state, you have two perceptions only. Ananda, I was happy. And Ajnanam, I did not know anything. What is the pramanam used for this knowledge? No pramanam. Because the pramata is not there in Sushupti. And therefore, in the absence of the pramata, how do you know this knowledge? There is no pramanam used. Therefore, it is nirnimitta bodhaha. It is intuitive knowledge only. So this is one way that Brahman is known through intuition. So one fine day you go into samadhi and then you wake up suddenly knowing that you are Brahman. Okay, that is intuitive That is the normal interpretation given by any yogi. If you ask him, what do you do samadhi for? You are going to keep on doing samadhi until one fine day, intuitively, you wake up from samadhi knowing that you are Brahman. So that is the first one. And there are some other people who give a different interpretation. So they say that pratibodha is a knowledge which occurs only once. So the final knowledge, the final Atma Jnanam that happens to you after you get Jnanam, and what happens? This Atma Jnanam happens in a flash. And when this happens in a flash, immediately you'll get Videha Mukti, which is not a very satisfactory, Atma Jnanam, if you ask me, because the moment you get Atma Jnanam, if you're going to die, there is a big problem, right? Who wants an Atma Jnanam which will kill you? So this is one of the second type of person who says Atma Jnanam happens in a flash. And in this flash, that one happening only, single occurrence only, this liberating knowledge happens. And when that knowledge happens, all the karma, including Sanchita, Prarabdha, Agami, everything is destroyed. Because Prarabdha is also destroyed, is instantly followed by Videha Mukti. This flash of realization is what is Pratibodha, these commentators say. Okay, so this is the two types of philosophies which Shankara discusses. We don't know the names of the philosophers. And Shankara says, it doesn't matter whether as you say, it is intuitive knowledge or not. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether knowledge comes once or many times. What is most important is Pratibodha eva hi saha. Pratibodha is that only, which is that consciousness which is available in every single thought of mine, and that Brahman is that consciousness. And that is the most important part of this particular mantra. So with this, we'll stop for today. Any questions?
Acharya, when we were talking about Sopadik Atma, is that the same as RC? Can we say?
It is the same as the RC. You are because associated with the mind.
Right.
And when you are the RC, I mean, you are a Jiva, right? Full-fledged Jiva. Full-fledged Jiva is also RC. So you can say, I know my fingers. You can say, I know my hands. In both cases, you are associating with I. Right. So there is one part of you associating with another part of you. That possible, that usage is possible.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever Shastra says Atma should know itself, that is what it means. The RC should know the OC. The Sopadika Atma should know the Niropadika Atma is the meaning. Very small little Upanishad, but very beautiful one. So we have taken almost 3 sessions over one mantra. So you can imagine how important the mantra. I told you in the very beginning that is one of the most important mantras in all of Vedanta literature.
Acharya, may I ask one? It's a small question.
Yeah, of course.
This was according to the Vaisheshika Matam. This is just for I missed one portion. The 9 dravyas.
Yeah.
That Rishi Kanad speaks of. One is the Panchamahabhutas.
Panchamahabhutas. Kalaha, Dik, directions.
Dik, okay.
Dik. And then Mana and Atma.
Right.
All are inert. Okay, one thing I must caution you that when you are going over these lectures, please always remember which is the Purva-Paksha view and which is the Vedanta view. Because I am talking as if it is my view when I am discussing with Purva-Paksha, but really that has to be kept in mind that this is Purva-Paksha view. Okay, and it becomes more important if you are reading Shankara Bhashyam in any form, because Shankara doesn't explain. He starts, this is a view. And you have to summarize, oh, this is Purva-Paksha view, not Shankara's view.
Another question, when we were doing the chapter 18 Bhashyam, we talked of Vaisheshika theory there also in renunciation of action.
Yeah.
So we had talked about Dvayanuka, the atoms are always present and in contact they form molecules, something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So that it means the same thing. The
It's the
Atma
same
and-
thing. The same thing. You have there will be went a little bit more detail. We talk about atoms and then molecules and then
Right.
elements. That's all. This is a very superficial view.
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
So the thing about Shankara Bhashyam is that it brings you in contact with the views of other matams, which otherwise you would not directly study, because we don't really have the wherewithal, the time for all that. So that's why Shankara Bhashyam is so important. That's why right now, whatever we are doing, I'm doing with Shankara Bhashyam, so that, we are able to understand. And this will become only more intensive. In Taittiriya Bhashyam, it is more intensive. In what you call Mandukya Bhashyam, it is more intensive. So once Taittiriya and Mandukya are over, then we can relax and go back to non-Bhashyam texts again. We can do the Brihadaranyaka, which again, without the Bhashyam, because it's Brihadaranyaka anyway is so big that with the Bhashyam, it will last until my Prarabdha expires. So I don't want that happening. Okay, so. Okay, thank you for your patience, everybody. Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavasishyate Om Shanti Shanti
Shanti
Shanti.
Shanti.
Om Tat Sat, Om Namah Shivaya. Thank you for your patience.
Thank
Thank you,
Acharya.
Acharya.
Thank you, Acharya.